I made a video some months ago, year ago, something like that, about sexual abuse of sons by mothers. Seemed like a lot of people liked it and found value in it, but I also had a lot of people who were like, how is that possible? That doesn't happen. What you described is not sexual abuse, etc., etc., etc. Especially since I wasn't physically touched by my own mother in a sexual way. And a lot of the stuff that I talked about in that video was not of a sexual abuse of the type that so often men do to children, especially men do to girls, with penetration and touching their bodies in different ways. A lot of the sexual abuse I experienced from my mom never had physical touch at all. And people didn't know what I was talking about, or they denied it outright. So what I would like to do is talk about some different ways in which mothers, and this could be fathers too, this could be fathers toward daughters, but I'm being very specific here about mothers and their relationship with their sons. How mothers can sexually abuse their sons without ever actually touching them. So, one way, one of the simplest ways, is to have sexually charged conversations with their sons. I think this can be pretty common, and it's something that I experienced. My mother telling me about her sex life, telling me about her sex life with my dad, telling me about her sex life when she was a teenager, being explicit and telling me about her experience of going through puberty, telling me about other girls going through puberty, and not doing it in a way that was neutral. Because some of these things, perhaps, especially at a certain age, I could consider that a mother might be able to do in an educational way that could be even potentially useful for a son. I think what I experienced in my life, actually I know what I experienced in my life, was my mother was talking about this stuff in a way that she was getting off on it. Now, my mother was someone who had been sexually abused in her life in different ways in her family of origin. Her father was a pervy guy, a real sicko in some ways, and she experienced other stuff that she told me about that was sexually abuse outside of her family. Probably the stuff that happened inside her family set her up for it. But as a result, my mom was very confused sexually. She had a lot of unresolved trauma around sexuality, and a lot of the bad sexual stuff that she had experienced, she experienced in relationship to men, to males, even to boys. And so she had me as her son, her only son. She had full power over me in the way that moms do. And I think she was trying to resolve some of her sexual traumatic stuff, some of her unresolved sexual traumas in her relationship with me, and also just trying to explore it. Or maybe even if she wasn't so consciously trying to resolve it, she was just acting it out, some of the stuff that had happened to her. And some of the ways she did it was by talking with me. Now, she had ways to rationalize it. Oh, it's being educational, I'm being helpful to him, I'm teaching him how the world works. But I could feel it at an emotional level. I knew there was a weird dynamic going on with her. There was a sexualized dynamic. There was sexualized energy happening in the stuff she was sharing with me. And part of how I knew it is it made me feel uncomfortable. It didn't feel neutral to me. I remember when we had sexual education in school, 7th grade, I think, 8th grade, even 9th grade a little bit. These teachers, these health teachers would get up and we had books and they talked about sexual stuff. It was different. This was just, there was something objective and neutral about it. When my mom talked about it with me, it was like charged somehow. There was a sexual charge in it. Later, this is kind of stuff that I felt subliminally then, but later when I was an adult and I knew what it meant to have a sexually charged conversation, I knew what sexual relationships were when I started having girlfriends and hookups and stuff like that, and I wasn't always so healthy about it because of the way in which I had been raised. I had to learn how to be healthy. I had to learn how to resolve a lot of this stuff. But later, once I had more of an adult experience of sexual interaction with people, I knew what charged sexual relationships were, and I knew what relationships that were not charged were all about. And my mother, when I look back on it, there was an emotional charge. So all of these things that I'm talking about are things that, or at least a lot of them, I think that I will be talking about, things that conceivably could be very similar to relationships or dynamics or things that happen that are not sexual abuse. But when you add that sexual charge into it, that's when it gets weird, and that's where a violation happens. And I think my mom, and I've seen this with a lot of other moms, and I've heard this from a lot of people, men who talk about their experiences or have told me about their experiences when they were boys, that when their moms, or grandmothers even sometimes, aunts also, perhaps even older sisters, did things or talked about things with them or had experiences with them, if there was a sexual charge, that was where the abuse was happening. If these same things had happened without that sexual charge, it wouldn't have been weird. It wouldn't have been so bothersome. It wouldn't have been a violation. So that's a really important key. So if people say that's not sexual abuse, I would say if there wasn't that sexual charge, if there wasn't that weirdness, if there wasn't that feeling of strange discomfort, like, wait a second, what is the subliminal message here? Is this, am I just being educated? Or is there something weird going on here? I think when that weirdness goes on, that's when the sexual abuse comes in. So that would be my answer to people who say, that's not sexual abuse. And I could say, well, I think it is. So actually, now let me move on to the next thing. And it relates very much to the first one. Moms who use their nudity, use their exposed physical body in a way that's sexually abusive with their sons. I had this happen also. My mom, in different ways, flaunted her body with me in sexual ways. And I've heard about this from a lot of other men who talk about their moms exposing their bodies to them. Now, does that mean that inherently any time a mother shows, let's say, her breasts or other parts of her body with her son, that is automatically sexual abuse? No, I don't think so. I think there's cultures that actually are much more non-sexual or neutral about the nude female body or parts of the female body. I think in our culture it's a little different. It can be a little bit more conservative about showing the female body. But I think what happened is, in the context of my culture, the way my mother physically showed her body to me at various times, sometimes when she was drunk also, were ways that had a very negative effect on me sexually. And I saw this actually, because my mom wasn't the only adult woman I saw naked as a child, because I remember one time I saw a friend's mom naked, and he told me about the way his mom would be naked in front of him. She never laid a hand on him, but it was totally creepy. It was sexualized. It was sexual abuse. It was like she was being exhibitionistic with her son in ways that were more extreme than what my mom did. But my mom did it too. And the ways that she showed her body to me had a sexual charge in the relationship she had with me, in the context of our history, in the ways that she had already had sexualized conversation, talked about sex. The things that she did, I just knew it intuitively. It was sexualized, and she knew it too. She just never admitted it. In fact, she flat out denied it. She made it out like, oh, it's okay. But really, she was engaging in a kind of sexual relationship with me that was incestuous. It was violating of me. And it screwed me up in all sorts of ways. It brought up all sorts, and this is before I was even in puberty, but it happened after I was in puberty too, and during the process. It was like very confusing to me. It brought up all these feelings. I had nobody to talk about it with. The last person I could talk about it with was my mom, and my dad was clueless. He was inappropriate in his own ways. I could never talk about it with him. There were no other adults I felt safe to talk about it with. So what did I do? I just put it away. I dissociated from my feelings. I dissociated from my uncomfortableness. I dissociated from my frustration, even my anger at sometimes, my feelings of weirdness and humiliation. I split it off. I put it into my unconscious. That for me meant that it was overwhelming to me. It was traumatizing to me. It was a violation. It was sexual abuse to me, the way that she flaunted her body. And really unpleasant. By the way, this is not fun to talk about. It's uncomfortable. But the reason I'm talking about it is to clarify some of the points that I made. Because also what I found is making that video, from the feedback I got, it actually was useful to a lot of people. Now, another way that moms can sexually abuse their sons, a way that I experienced, and I talked about it a little bit in the first way, was through giving sexual education, as it were. And what I found from my mom, from a very young age, she wanted to give me sexual education. Where do babies come from? She talked about it with me when I think I was 2 or 3 years old, and she was very explicit about it. And you might say, oh, she was progressive, she was a hippie, she was giving me real knowledge that it's good for a child to have. But it was not the way she did it. She did it when I was, first of all, way too young. I don't think a 3-year-old, even a 4-year-old, has any need to know about that stuff. And it wasn't like I was spontaneously coming to her and asking her. But let's say I had been. Let's say I'd been a precocious 4-year-old who'd somehow heard about some of like where babies came from, and I was asking. What I've seen, been around a lot of children. I've seen a lot of children with their parents talking about this stuff. I've had a lot of my friends who are parents talk about this stuff with me. Their child brings it up. How do you talk about it? Well, what I've learned is you can talk about this stuff with your child. In fact, I think as a parent, it's vitally important to talk about it with your child, but to talk about it in an appropriate way. Little children don't need all sorts of explicit details. My mom gave me explicit details that were not necessary. I mean, she told me about her period. I saw my mom's bloody underwear when I was a kid. I'm sorry if this is too much information, disgusting. As a child, for me, it was too much information. It's like things that I had no need to know about. Hearing her getting pregnant, I didn't need to hear about orgasms. I didn't need to hear about all sorts of stuff that she talked about her relationship with my dad. She did things with me, talking about things with me, never laying a hand on me, but doing it under the guise of education, of increasing my knowledge. Well, in a way it did increase my knowledge, and in a way it wasn't education, but it was a perverse education, and it was too much information. It was also sexually loaded. It was weird the way her eyes would change when she would talk about it with me. It wasn't just being neutral and objective. Later, when I heard about people being sexually abused, mostly unfortunately girls by men being sexually abused by men, it's like I heard many, many stories when I was a therapist, and just from friends of mine who were women talking about when they were children. Sometimes the sexual abuse that they went through was done to them under the guise of the men saying, oh, this is educational. I'm just giving you education. Sometimes even the men, when they got caught, would say, no, 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 I was just giving them education. Well, my mom did that to me, and guess what? Her primary motive was not to educate me, even if she consciously thought it was education. That was a defense for her. That was a rationalization. The primary motive was, I think, to act out her trauma, and at some level, she was getting off on it. She enjoyed it at some kind of weird post-traumatic sexualized level. It gave her a sense of power. I think she also, at some level, liked watching me be uncomfortable. I think, in a way, she had been made uncomfortable by her dad. She'd been made uncomfortable by her other men, and she was kind of empowering herself by making me feel weird and making me feel awkward. She was also exploring some of these dynamics, and it was twisted, and it had a very negative effect on me. Later, when I was able to look at it in context, I was able to say, this is sexual abuse. Yet, it wasn't sexual abuse in the conventional, typical sense of having had someone lay their hands on me. She never touched me again. That's why I came up with that phrase, most incest never involves physical touch, because that was my experience. And I think most of the incestuous stuff that happens in families doesn't involve touch. I think a lot does, but I think most doesn't. Now, another way that moms can sexually abuse their sons in a way, unfortunately, that I have personally experienced is through sharing inappropriate videos or movies or television shows or literature. I had all of these things. I remember, how old was I? 6, 7, 8 years old when we went to see The Blue Lagoon with Brooke Shields in a theater. There was overt sexual stuff happening in this, like explicit descriptions of sexual stuff happening between actually an underage boy and a girl, like showing their bodies, showing all this nudity, showing sexual stuff, talking about periods and freaking out and sort of very uncomfortable sexual dynamics going on. And it was like, I was way too young for this. This was too much information for a little boy to be shown this stuff. It was like, for me as a child, that was pornography. And I saw other stuff. I remember sitting with my parents and watching television, late night television, and seeing like sexual scenes on television that were really twisted. Also being allowed to watch movies that were like, I remember there was a rape scene. My mom let me see this, a rape scene that I watched, and how old was I? 13, 14 years old. Totally inappropriate to be watching. I consider the fact that she not only let me see this, but actually showed it to me, brought me to this situation, was like, why was she doing this? This like twisted me. I had overwhelming, unpleasant feelings about it. I was violated. My innocence was violated as the result of this. And that was just the start. Then it got into the books that she shared with me. She would give me all sorts of books that she read because I was a precocious reader, so a lot of anything. I would read anything that was handed to me if I liked it, if it was interesting. And she was giving me books from when I was 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, once I had enough of a vocabulary to be able to read adult content because I could follow what it was about and I was curious. I remember reading stuff like she gave me The Clan of the Cave Bear, that book by Jean Auel, and the books that came after that. Explicit rape scenes, lots of like explicit sexual stuff going on between adults and not adults, sometimes children, sexual stuff going on, and reading this stuff, it was like stuff that I didn't need to know. And my mom knew exactly what was in it. It was totally inappropriate for me to be reading this. It was wrong. And yet she was giving it to me. And it was like putting all these ideas in my head that I wasn't ready to handle. I didn't have the emotional capacity to handle it. And what I lost as a result of that violation was my innocence. And I think when a parent, when a mom, dad, anybody gives this kind of stuff to a child who's not ready to be knowing this stuff that's presented for adults, for children, it's a violation. It's wrong. And it really harmed me. And I feel like I lost a lot, and I felt violated by it. So I put that in the category of sexual abuse without touch ever happening. Now, another thing was actually my mom allowing me to have explicit pornography. I remember we once stayed at a hotel, and I would explore, anywhere we would go, like a hotel, I would want to explore every avenue of it. I remember going into the closet and climbing up and saying, ooh, what can I find? Maybe there's money. Maybe somebody hid money up there. Well, I found a box of pornography up there, and I brought it down, and I was like, oh my God. Considering I'd already been, reading some of these novels that my mom had, but I'd never seen these pictures. And this was long before the internet came out, so I didn't have access to pornography in the sad and horrible way that children do now so easily. Well, I was looking at this stuff, and my dad found it. He was, Daniel, you cannot have that. That's inappropriate. Well, guess what, Dad? Thank you. You were right. Then my mom came along, and I said, Mom, but I want it, especially since she'd been feeding me literature about this and movies and all the sexualized talk she'd been having. I was confused, and I liked it. Well, guess what? I wasn't old enough to know what was healthy for me and what wasn't. Maybe I was 12, 13 years old at that point. And some of this stuff was kind of hardcore. It was really not good stuff for me to be looking at. Ideas that I shouldn't have been exposed to at that age. It was like bad for my innocence, bad for my growth. Well, my mom contradicted my dad and said, no, he can have it. And she put down her foot and she said, he can have it. This is real information and we're not going to censor him. So she took an anti-censorship point of view. She took an anti-censorship stance. Well, guess what? She was wrong, because this stuff was stuff that a parent should have protected me. So when my dad dragged it out in the hall and said, get rid of it, my mom went out and took it back and said, I could have it. And guess what? I kept it. And some of it was really sick stuff that I shouldn't have known about, I shouldn't have seen, I shouldn't have looked at, I shouldn't have read those stories, because I read a lot of that stuff in those magazines, and it was twisted, and it screwed me up. And I really blame my mom for it. She should have protected me from this stuff. And it was so easy to just say, no, not okay. And that would have also told me a lesson about sexuality. That it's good to have boundaries. It's good to not look at this stuff. It's good to not indulge in some of this really perverse stuff. This is twisted stuff. Also, I don't want to go off on pornography in general, but I think pornography is bad for the people who look at it, and it's also bad for the people who make it. It's like, this is not empowering stuff. This is not empowering of women to do this with their bodies. Later, as a therapist, I talked to many women who made pornography, and it's like, guess what? So many of them were sexually abused. They talked about their sexual abuse history. They talked about the violations they'd experienced in their lives. Ironically, some of it with their dads, and some of it also with their moms. They learned really bad lessons about their bodies, about violations, about exposing themselves, about other people exposing themselves. And sometimes, often, they made pornography. They got into the porn industry. They got into becoming sex workers as a way to unconsciously try to resolve their sexual violations, their histories of sexual abuse, often right in their own families of origin. So when my mom is exposing me to this, she's also exposing me to other people acting out their histories of violations. Also, the men, often men who are making this pornography, they're twisted also. A lot of these men have been violated in all sorts of ways. Otherwise, if they weren't violated, they wouldn't make this stuff. It wouldn't make any sense. So for me, I'm being exposed to all these different levels of sexually traumatized people acting out their unresolved sexual traumas through photographs in ways that, like, I shouldn't have been exposed to, especially as a boy, 12, 13, 14 years old. I was by no means an appropriate audience for this stuff. Or I should say, I don't think anybody is an appropriate audience for this stuff, but I was even less of an appropriate audience for this stuff than an adult would have been. And my mother was giving it to me. I really take that as a sexual violation. Now, my dad ended up siding with her, so I think he's wrong too. So even though his initial reaction was quite correct, this is not okay for my son to see, he gave in to my mom, and therefore he's complicit with her, so I consider it a violation from him too. Now let me think, what is another way that a mom can sexually abuse her son? Well, I think it's probably the final way that I can think of. But I experienced this with my mom. Her invading my relationship with peer girls, invading my dating life, putting pressure on me to date, making me feel like if I wasn't dating the right girl or dating a girl, that there was something weird about me, something wrong with me. I wasn't living up to being a man. I wasn't being a proper man. I wasn't on the path to being the right kind of man I was supposed to be. Also, my mom asking me, so are you dating? Are you kissing? What's going on in your relationship with these girls? My mom also talking about girls, talking about their bodies, talking about their girls going through puberty, pointing out their bodies to me. It's like, stay the F out of my life. That's what she should have done, and I didn't know it enough at the time to say, stay out of my business. I think part of it also was my mom was neglecting me in a lot of different ways, so when she paid attention to me this way, it was like, oh, I misinterpreted it as, oh, she's loving me. And I think that was a setup for her, in a way. She set this dynamic up where she wasn't loving me in all sorts of ways I needed love. She wasn't giving me all sorts of nurturance and boundaries and guidance and care and interest in ways that I needed, or in ways that I needed it back then. And instead, she was making up for the ways she wasn't really appropriately meeting my needs by coming in and getting involved in my very personal life in inappropriate ways. And what I eventually realized is I never want to talk about dating with my mom. I never wanted to talk about girls that I had crushes on because my mom was so weird about it. She was strange about it. She would ask strange and inappropriate questions. I would just feel the way she changed. It was like, kind of like when they say guys who sexually abuse women or girls, their eyes change, they become strange, the tone of their voice changes. It's like you can sense that their motives have changed. That's what I went through with my mom. She never extended it to touching me in any way, but she just changed, and I felt that she had some strange need to talk about it with me that served her own weird, uncomfortable, unresolved, unprocessed feelings and history that really negatively affected me. And some intuitive part of me was like, you're staying out of my life. This is a boundary. And eventually at a certain age, I would never, ever talk about girls with her. And then later she was like, is Daniel gay? He never talks about girls, things like that. But it was like, No, it wasn't that. It wasn't that I was gay. It's just that I didn't want her involved in my life in any way. And I also extended that to my dad. The last person I wanted to talk about girls with at a certain point was my dad, in part because my dad also had really weird sexual boundaries. And he was weird around girls that I would bring around. So I was like, no, I don't want him violating me either. So it's not like it was just my mom that had weird sexual boundaries, because my dad did too. But primarily, I really do feel it was my mom that caused the most violation of me and the most harm. So I hope this explains myself a little bit better, explains my point of view. And I know this is weird, and I feel weird about having talked about it. But again, the reason that I share about it, and I hope I didn't share too explicitly, but the reason I share about it is that so maybe it will help some other people get a little bit more perspective on their life in some way or other, and hopefully in some way it will be useful to other people.